It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks everyone for taking time to join or to listen in afterwards. I love the community and the work that everyone is doing across Work on Climate. Been following and lurking in the different Slack threads. And I'm excited to tell you a bit about Therma, the company that I founded and run, as well as talk more about the state of the cold chain, the refrigeration supply chain around the world, and how it impacts human health and planet health. Sam, if you wouldn't mind giving me presenter access, I'll walk through a quick, well, maybe not quick. My friends joke I'm a recovering lawyer, so I talk too much and too fast. But there is a slide deck which I can share afterwards as well, and I'll just walk everyone through a short overview on the state of the cold chain and talk a bit about some of the solutions that are developing and being created, as well as Therma and what we're building. Very excited to be here. Just a little bit of background on myself, and let me go ahead and jump in. My name's Manik Suri. I'm the founder and CEO at Therma. I started my career in government and finance, worked in the Obama White House doing economic policy in the first Obama administration, worked at a big hedge PE fund called D.E. Shaw, doing India-China investing from 06 to 10. Went to Harvard for undergrad and then went back for law school. And got inspired around the opportunity to kind of build technology to improve public problems, solving public problems, and helping to kind of bring better tools into workflows and industries that were legacy, that were kind of being underinvested in. And we stumbled into the cold chain a bit accidentally. We were working in the food supply chain, building compliance and safety management tools, and we realized there was a huge opportunity around refrigeration broadly. And so we'll start by talking about the cold chain and then end with a little bit of our work. But the thesis here, the kind of topic, is about the kind of tension between human health and planet health that we face. So this is my grandmother, Kanta, over on the left, and that's me. My grandma is a doctor. She's based in Delhi. And a few weeks ago, she was fortunate enough to go by the local dispensary and get her COVID-19 vaccination. She was one of the fortunate few at that time. And as many of you, I'm sure, are following day to day and week to week, there are still billions of people around the planet that don't have access to vaccines. And so we are still living amidst a very tense and very challenging time as the global pandemic rages. This is me over on the right in San Francisco getting my COVID vaccine, and we're again part of the privileged few. These COVID vaccines are made possible by the cold chain. The cold chain is vital, but few people have actually heard of it. It's a critical infrastructure layer that's been around for 150 years when refrigeration was invented, that now covers 200 million refrigerated units in the commercial world, and then hundreds of millions of refrigeration units in the domestic world. Most of these refrigeration units sit in two major supply chains, food and pharma. But there's a tension between the benefits that the cold chain offers to human health and the challenges it poses to the planet's health. And that's what we're going to talk about. So what is the cold chain? Well, the cold chain is really a network of temperature-controlled supply chains that starts from production all the way down to consumption. The cold chain covers a range of perishable goods, including fruits and vegetables, dairy, pharmaceuticals, drugs and vaccines, blood and plasma, even chemicals, flowers, and interestingly, data. Data centers themselves sit in refrigerated warehouses that are essentially giant refrigeration boxes where farms and large banks of CPUs control the cloud. The cold chain we think of as three segments. We describe the cold chain as storage, which is closest to production; transportation, which is all the trucks, trains, and ships that are refrigerated that move stuff; and retail, which is all of the commercial or retail establishments where product is stored before it goes into our bodies. That's the restaurants, convenience stores, supermarkets, pharmacies, blood banks, etc., hospitals that store product right before it goes into our bodies. There are two major cold chains that store most of the valuable product that moves through the world, and those are the food and pharma cold chains. And our work at Therma focuses on both of these, and both of these move huge amounts of inventory. Over $1 trillion worth of inventory moves through the cold chain every year. And when we think about the state of the cold chain today, food right now is the most important downstream market. And that is because of a huge growth in frozen foods over the past several decades, the continued growth of food retail as middle classes around the world continue to improve and enhance their standard of living, and a rise in e-commerce and online shopping in the last few years has given a big boost to food cold chain and food storage. Then lastly, we've got new trends emerging around reducing food waste, which is a topic that we care a lot about and we'll talk about in the context of the climate. And of course, there's growing regulatory pressure and regulatory changes in the past decade. Both the European Union and the US regulatory bodies have passed significant regulations to improve food safety and quality at the federal and at the pan-European level, which have put a lot more pressure on the cold chain to improve. But the reality is we still need a lot more cold chain. The pharma side of this, and as many people have been following, there is a huge dearth in access to perishables. On the pharma side, we see this most acutely right now with what's going on with vaccine delivery and vaccine supply. Huge parts of the world still don't have access to temperature-sensitive vaccines. The Associated Press last October estimated that about 3 billion people could be without a vaccine for the next 2 years because of inadequate cold chain. And that's a lot of people. It's just a huge swath of humanity. And so if you think about that, that's kind of the human need and the human demand around why cold chain is growing and so important. The cold chain is expected to continue booming. It's growing at a very fast clip and is expected to triple essentially in size from 18 to 26. So we're seeing a very large increase in the cold chain infrastructure. Today, most of the cold chain value is on the food side relative to pharma, but it's shifting. We're seeing in the food side a distribution across storage, transport, and retail. The majority of products sits on the retail end of the cold chain, and that's because these products tend to be low value, meaning the average inventory pallet value is low, but there's a lot of it. That's your fruits and vegetables, your dairy, your proteins that sit in restaurants, convenience stores, cafeterias, and homes. And so it's typically distributed across a lot of locations. Pharma, on the other hand, tends to be highly concentrated. It's very high value inventory that's concentrated in large format warehouses and transit. And so you tend to see a lot more inventory value in the upper parts of the supply chain. Now, pharma is growing relative to other industries in the cold chain space, and the pharmaceutical industry is seeing a significant boom, not just in the broad swath of perishables, but in a special class of compounds that are biopharmaceuticals that are highly temperature sensitive and very expensive. These are a new type of compounds that are currently both experimental and emerging that offer a new type of treatment, a new type of treatment class for whole ranges of diseases. And so we're going to see a lot more growth in the cold chain as biologics, as they're called, continue to grow over the next 10 years. The challenge, of course, with this cold chain is that the human health that it enables in terms of providing us with the food and sustenance, as well as the pharmaceuticals and vaccines that we need, comes at a significant cost to the planet. And that's really the tension we face. So let's talk about the colder the cold chain gets and the warmer the planet becomes. Well, what's amazing is that the cold chain across all of its elements accounts for about 10% of CO2 emissions. That's huge. That's a very, very significant number, 10% of global CO2 emissions. That's broken down into a few different areas. There's energy, which is the electricity typically that powers the cold chain, is roughly 4% of that 10% impact. Food waste, which if it were taken as a country alone, as some have pointed out, would be one of the third largest emitter if it were a country, is a significant driver of waste. And much of that, though not all of that, is because of supply chain and storage and handling issues. There's also other reasons why food waste exists. But from a cold chain standpoint, it accounts for about 4% of the total CO2 emissions. And then lastly, there's this special class of compounds, the refrigerants that go into the cold chain that provide the cooling effect. They're actually, these refrigerants act like superheating molecules. They have the heating effect of between 1,000 and 9,000 times typical CO2. So they are superheating and they get released when refrigeration units go down or at their end of life. They're a big cause of emissions as well. And so we see a lot of opportunity here and a lot of need for improvement. 10% of global electricity consumption across the cold chain, a huge percentage of the petroleum and the fuel needed to move the product across large distances, because we want to have fruits and vegetables out of season, because we get proteins from other continents, because we're expecting to be able to have anything at any time on our plates. This has led to a significant impact on the transit segment. When you think about refrigerants, this is the global warming potential of CO2, and this is the global warming potential of the refrigerant F gases. They are much, much more warming, in some cases up to almost 12,000 times more warming than CO2, depending on the gases that are used. So just significant climate impact of these refrigerants. The human health and planet health tension is really front and center today. We need the cold chain. We need it more than ever. It's about life and death. We have to get vaccines to billions of people around the world, and we probably will have to keep getting vaccines. Based on the latest scientific data suggesting that vaccine efficacy is not going to be forever, we're probably going to have to get into a dynamic where vaccines are regularly provided for COVID-19 in the years ahead. Right now, the WHO estimates that between 25 and 30% of vaccines are degraded because of shipping issues, and most of those are temperature related. That's just a massive amount of loss, which we really can't afford. And when you think about the human toll, that's a lot of lives. There are a lot of lives at stake with that kind of vaccine potential. And then it's also about the sustenance that enables life around the world. And there's a huge amount of food waste that could be avoided, that could reduce both supply chain pressures and also help in developing economies in particular, where the majority of the waste occurs. When you think about the fact that 30% of global food that's produced gets wasted, just a massive number. That's a third of all food that we make, we just end up throwing away. And the vast majority of that happens in supply chain in the developing countries. I think there might be a question, so I'm just going to pause here. Okay. We'll keep going and then talk a bit about the work we're doing. So what does this look like? Well, the food and the kind of broad emissions potential of the cold chain, if you're thinking about food waste, the amount of land needed to produce that kind of food is like 2 times the size of Australia. And that amount of waste is more than the total emissions that India produces, one of the largest economies in the world. Not just the environment at stake here. We've got huge amounts of dollars that get thrown away. Nearly half a trillion dollars worth of food gets lost in supply chains. And we've got hundreds of millions of people that are chronically undernourished. So the inefficiencies and the wastage across the supply chain, and the cold chain in particular, has a lot of implications, both economic and environmental. And we all know about the climate crisis. That's why we're here today. But it's just kind of incredible when you think about the amount that this problem in the cold chain is growing. Today, less than 10% of temperature-sensitive foods have access to cold chain. Less than 10% of the food that could be stored in cold chain is stored in cold chain, which is another way of saying the cold chain has just barely begun to exist. There's going to be a huge amount of additional cold chain coming. When you think about cold storage, for example, this is gives you kind of a window into just how little cold storage exists today, particularly in developing economies. In the US, we have around 2.5 people per cubic meter of cold storage. In China, there are about 12 people per cubic meter, and in India, closer to 19 people per cubic meter. Those numbers are shifting, and these countries are building huge amounts of cold storage and cold transit infrastructure. Here's another example. In the transit segment, France has 140,000 refrigerated vehicles for a population of 65 million. China has 66,000 refrigerated vehicles today, and it has 1.3 billion people. Those numbers are going to shift. We are seeing huge growth in this infrastructure. And so you've got 15+% CAGR growth rates for cold chain in places like India and China, which is wonderful for human health. It's really going to be a huge improvement and provide for better access to perishables, both food and pharma and data, but it's going to come with significant implications for the climate. And that's why we say the cold chain is at a crossroads today. So the last part of the presentation, just want to talk about some of the solutions that are emerging and what we need. The cold chain as a massive infrastructure layer is still pretty dumb today. It's pretty under-optimized and pretty invested in from a technology standpoint. Most of the technology is decades, if not closer to a century old in terms of the infrastructure. There's not a lot of real-time management or optimization going on. And that's where I think there's a huge opportunity for technologists, for innovators, for entrepreneurs to play a role. We've got a couple of areas of innovation in the smart cold chain. Broadly, a smart cold chain should substantially reduce the impact on the environment of these activities by both controlling emissions and reducing waste. Controlling emissions of refrigerants, reducing waste of energy and product. So there's a number of areas where we're seeing innovation in the smart cold chain. We're starting to see more and more opportunity around temperature and conditions monitoring in real time. That's an area that Therma, the company I run, plays in. We're seeing more and more real-time logging and tracking of product as it moves to help reduce waste and spoilage in transit. A lot more sophisticated inventory management and warehouse management systems are starting to emerge to help reduce both the energy costs and the temperature, as well as humidity wastage. That's often, we call it overcooling. There's a huge amount of overcooling that goes on right now. And then there's a lot of waste of the inventory itself because of spoilage events, because of grid failures, because of equipment malfunction and human error. And there's a lot of opportunity to optimize those with technology. These are some of the big areas where we're seeing innovation. You can imagine cloud-based dashboards and real-time data tracking being a whole area of innovation, and a number of startups and established players are working on this using a combination of cloud, web applications, and then real-time movement tracking for conditions and inventory management. On the IoT and built environment side, we're seeing a number of players working on everything from temperature to pressure to humidity controls, as well as reporting and analytics around energy spend, energy consumption, demand optimization, ways to reduce the amount of energy needed to hold and move this kind of product globally. You're also seeing, and we're seeing a number of players working on the data layer, thinking about ways to analyze and adjust conditions, in particular temperature, which is a big driver, obviously, of energy spend and spoilage, and using newer data technologies involving AI and human-assisted machine learning. We're seeing some companies starting to build really interesting analytics packages. Therma is doing that as well, using human-assisted ML right now. We can talk more about that at the end of the prezo. We're also seeing automation at the level of packing and moving and storing. The robotics industry is starting to play a role in the cold storage in particular, and the retail segments. We're starting to reduce the amount of person power needed and also the waste associated. And then we're obviously looking at and seeing a number of folks working on the transit segment. Of course, electrifying the transit layer would help both on energy spend and massively impact the carbon footprint and reduce the carbon footprint of the transportation layer. And electrification is occurring across certain innovators in certain parts of cold chain around the world, and we see an opportunity there. Temperature, of course, is one of the key parts of the cold chain. It is all about keeping stuff cold, after all, and the opportunity here to reduce both the human cost, meaning the wasted vaccines, and as well reduce the energy and product costs associated with that kind of waste is really what motivates us at Therma. And that's kind of why we work on the problem around the smart cold chain. We're trying to build infrastructure technologies that can minimize both the impact on the planet while advancing human health. So the goal here is to really build a cold chain that minimizes climate change while advancing human health. This is a picture of Delhi, New Delhi, the capital of India, where I was born. It's a place that's dear to my heart. You see the kind of air pollution and the smog and the growing climate impact on places like that, and you realize, wow, this is a real problem. This is actually a picture not of Delhi, but of the Bay Area where I live. This is last year. For those of you who are following the news, amidst the wildfires and the growing climatic events, the Bay Area and a lot of Northern California had almost apocalyptic conditions. This looks like it could be New Delhi, but it's actually a view from Oakland, looking out on the Bay Area, which is pretty disturbing and really speaks to just how much climate change impacts everyone. This is not a developing country problem. This is a global problem. And that's where we see an opportunity with the smart cold chain, at least in the context of trying to improve technologies and build technologies for problem areas that matter. We see this as a really powerful one. Would love to chat further if folks are interested. Our website is hellotherma.com. We're on Hello Therma on Twitter. I'm available after this conversation and also at any time. Feel free to contact me at Manik at hellotherma.com. That's Manik, M-A-N-I-K, at hellotherma.com. We are a venture-backed startup. We just closed another financing round. We've raised in this last round around 11 million in seed capital to continue growing the platform. We're hiring, and we are very much interested in working with passionate builders and passionate entrepreneurs and passionate activists just across the spectrum, really from any discipline that want to advance the cause around human health and planet health. Thanks again for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited for this group and the work that you guys are doing.
Thanks so much, Monica. That was a really powerful presentation. I want to open up to questions. If you have a question, feel free to either just unmute yourself and ask it directly, or you can type in the chat and I can ask it for you, or Monica, you can just read it. I'd just love to maybe kick things off by diving in quickly, and can you talk a little bit more about what you guys do at Therma yourselves? You mentioned briefly doing AI for temperature control. Is there anything else you can tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'd be happy to take questions directly, or please feel free to throw them in the chat. So Therma is a technology startup where we build a couple of different technologies around the cold chain. Therma consists of IoT-enabled sensors, web dashboards, and mobile apps to help track and monitor conditions, and then analytics to help optimize settings and drive efficiency over time. And so it's really a couple of layers to the cake as we describe it. The base layer is sensors. We use a type of sensor that communicates off of long-range radio or LoRaWAN technology, which allows us to get connectivity out of the inside of refrigeration units. Historically, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth-based IoT sensors couldn't get signal out reliably from the interior of a refrigeration environment. That's because the side of the refrigerators would act like a Faraday cage. And so historically, it was very hard to monitor cold chain in real time. And so we're often deploying sensors into locations that have never had real-time monitoring before. And so the sensors communicate with the gateway sends signal back using either cellular, 4G, or Wi-Fi. So there's the opportunity to kind of work off of the grid, off of Wi-Fi if needed. It can rely on 4G. And then the gateway communicates, server side. The software layers consist of web dashboarding tools that help you track, train, and see exceptions. That's necessary for compliance, necessary for quality management. And then with excursion and exception monitoring, you can see where the issues come up, help kind of identify and remediate them. And then ultimately our analytics work on predictive and backward looking, we call it predict and insight. Those are two product areas where you can both start to forecast where refrigeration might go down before it does by using historical trends on a particular piece of equipment. And insights is backward looking optimization suggestions. That's where we look at the data, and we describe that as human assisted ML. We have a team of analysts that are tagging patterns in the data that are basically identifying conditions and identifying patterns like, hey, this piece of equipment is running hot. Running hot can happen when the compressor is likely to go down, when there's a refrigerant leak, when there's a wiring issue that might need repair or maintenance or even replacement. And running hot ultimately consumes more power than needed and doesn't hold the product cold enough. And so that's an example. Another example of something we might find in the data is we see an outlier between 2 and 3 a.m. every week on Saturday. The walk-in freezer is left open because inventory delivery is happening and people just leave the door open for an hour and burn shelf life and burn energy. We can see that in the data, flag that. We sell Therma as a SaaS-based solution. So we sell it on a pure subscription model and offer this as a kind of monitoring plus analytics package to companies in food and beverage, and just now doing some early work in healthcare. But customers include, the kinds of brands you might hear about as a consumer in food and bev. So on the retail and restaurant side, we've got folks like McDonald's, Taco Bell, Burger King, Sonic, Pizza Hut, Domino's, 7-Eleven, Wyndham Hotels, Marriott Hotels, and others. And then up the supply chain, we work with food manufacturers and distributors, and also with a couple of folks in healthcare. So that's a little bit about us and Therma. Didn't want to make it a total pitch about the company, but we're based in the Bay Area. We're about a total of about 55 people, so still early stage company. And I'm happy to take questions. So I'm seeing some questions, or at least a question or comment in the Slack, if that's helpful to just jump in there, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great answer. Thank you. I can read out the question for you if you want.
Sure.
So Layman asks, adopting the cold chain infrastructure seems to be quite expensive, which would be a barrier for the developing countries. Would you say that the technological innovations have made the cold chain more affordable and accessible for developing countries? I imagine that if more people use the cold chain, there would be less food wasted and increased access to the vaccines.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's squarely on point. One of the big reasons why there's so much waste of product and such limited access to perishables is because the cold chain infrastructure has historically been quite expensive. There are a number of opportunities for technology to play a role, literally from every level of the stack. There are people working on cheaper and lower cost refrigeration, like literally like cheaper refrigerators and freezers. There are people working on last mile, that's more reliable and affordable, where you can have perishables that move from the retail environment to the house or the home without loss and waste. There's a lot of innovation happening there. There's innovation happening at the level of the cold storage box. A typical cold storage warehouse can cost $30 to $50 million to build. That's a lot of capital expense. So the CapEx spend $30, $50 million. Not easy to put those into areas in the developing world that have limited infrastructure spend and ability to afford that kind of box. You can have a bunch of those in California, have a bunch of those in the Eastern Seaboard, all over Europe, but it's not easy to put that kind of infrastructure. So we're seeing more micro cold storage and kind of smaller fulfillment type cold storage centers getting built that are both more efficient. They use less energy, less labor, and cheaper and better building materials, better insulation, less waste. Some of these boxes, when you look at them, it's kind of incredible to see how much waste there is. CB Richard Ellis, JLL, which is a real estate brokerage house, did a research report last year on the cold storage industry. In the US, the median age of a cold storage warehouse is 41 years. Median age, which means there's a bunch of warehouses that are built in World War II. I've visited a lot of these, and you see warehouses that use cork on the siding. Well, cork is not a great insulation material, so you're just having huge amounts of waste in those kinds of legacy infrastructure. And what we're seeing in the developing world in a lot of places now is smarter and better built infrastructure, and then also more monitoring of that infrastructure. So you don't need to overcool. You don't need to just waste energy and waste product. A lot of opportunity for technical innovation on multiple areas of the infrastructure and the monitoring.
So to follow up on that, I think you're saying the average cold storage warehouse costs like 30 to 50 million. How much do we need to get the cost down to in order to really make cold chains pervasive? Do you have a sense of like we need like a 50% reduction, or is this like a 98% reduction in costs, or how much further do we have to go?
Yeah, I mean it's a multi-pronged question. It's a great question, Sam. I think firstly, the cold storage supply chain is not just cold storage warehouses. Cold storage warehouses are in some ways the largest and most expensive infrastructure layer, but they're only one element of the cold chain. There's also the fulfillment centers and the distribution centers that are kind of one layer down. The trucks, trains, and ships, the refrigerated, they call them reefers, refrigerated containers. The industry calls them reefers. We need a lot more and better reefers. And then retail, we need a lot more and better retail cold chain, which are much smaller, much cheaper, but still necessary in pharmacies, blood banks, fertility clinics, urgent care centers, restaurants, cafeterias, hospitals. And then we need last mile. That's the stuff that moves the product from retail into your homes. All of those infrastructure layers need innovation and need to bend the cost curve down. So it's not like just improving the cost curve on the warehouse is going to solve the problem. Even if we were to reduce the cost on warehouses by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4, it's really the full downstream cold chain infrastructure that also needs to be innovated. And I think there's people working on different elements of that. The cold chain is a very large industry. We're talking about $1 trillion plus worth of inventory that moves through it. It's really not, you can't generalize about it because it covers so many different moving parts. But I would say if we want to get the cold chain to where it touches all of humanity, Right now, the cold chain is only covering, between 10 and 30% of the product that could move through it. That means there's a lot of product that's not kept in cold that could be. And so I think you can imagine a combination of significant bending of the cost curve down and improving access using smarter and better and more efficient. So I think cost is one element, but there's a number of things that need to happen, I think, for a cold chain to become pervasive. What's exciting is a lot of countries are investing heavily in cold chain in the developing world. We've talked to some of the leading experts in India and China about cold chain that's growing there, and we're partnering with some folks in Latin America and the Middle East and Africa to put technologies like Therma into those economies. Our goal is to make sure that the cold chain as it gets built is smart from the start point, not the kind of technology base that we've been using in places like the US, which is 40, 50, 60-year-old infrastructure. So we're trying to make sure the new cold chain stays smart from the beginning.
Got it. Thanks. And maybe getting back to what you guys are doing, but you mentioned overcooling as a big problem. I've also seen it used as a solution, and I'm wondering if you guys do that too. I've seen a few companies that are actually overcooling in warehouses on purpose at night when electricity is cheap, and then they need to cool way less during the day, and they're saving the emissions from the peaker plants, and they're saving a ton of money. Is that something you guys are doing as well?
Absolutely. And overcooling versus demand optimization, are kind of two related and mutually reinforcing concepts. What you're talking about is actually, I think, a very effective way of reducing energy cost and energy consumption while ultimately also reducing total cooling. So what Sam's talking about around demand optimization and demand response is an example of running warehouses or any energy consumptive infrastructure at times of day where energy is cheaper and more available, and allowing the thermal mass to hold cold during the hot times of day. So for example, a classic would be energy is typically cheaper at night when people are sleeping, more expensive in the morning and afternoon and early evening when people are having dinner and showering and doing stuff. So if you can run the warehouse cold at night and then turn it off during the day, again, that's super simplistic. The models are actually a little more involved depending on local demand and local energy rates and seasonality, but you can actually reduce the cost by using the cheaper power timing to get the cooling effect, hold it cold during the more expensive times of day. That's actually not overcooling. That's just cooling more intelligently at times of day when energy is cheaper. Overcooling is a different problem, which is running the box too cold all the time, which is what a lot of companies do today. That's inefficient and wasteful. But running the box cold at times of day when it's actually cheaper and when it can then hold the cooling effect in the warm and more expensive times is ultimately not as much cooling. It doesn't use up as much total aggregate cooling. So we are supporting a couple of players in the third-party logistics space by providing them with real-time visibility into warehouse heat distribution so that they can then decide when to turn power off and power back on, when and how long they can run the box essentially cold. There's another word for that, which is called flywheeling. You think of the warehouse as a battery. And so flywheeling is essentially a way of kind of using the thermal mass to kind of hold the cooling effect and then not have to power it during expensive times of day. So yeah, we are working with some companies to do early flywheeling using real-time heat distribution data.
Got it. Thank you. Anyone, please interrupt me at any time. Otherwise, I'll just keep diving into questions. I'd love to hear more about the refrigerant side of things. You were talking about the F gases, the refrigerants being up to 12,000 times worse than CO2. And I remember seeing a really interesting stat that in grocery stores, the I think refrigerants tend to leak out at about 30% a year in the stat I was seeing. And a lot of this is just because grocery stores aren't aware of it. They might like do maintenance on it and just like vent the refrigerants out to the atmosphere or whatever. And then in the study they did not pass any policy or require the grocery stores to reduce their wastage whatsoever, but all they did was tell them about the problem and give them a way to measure it. And I think they must have given them some IoT sensors. And they found that just by giving them this data and telling them about it, those leaks were reduced immediately by 10%. Or not by 10%, but like by 10% overall, like down from 30% to 20%. So I was wondering if you had any insights on that, if you guys have played in actively like reducing the refrigerants themselves, or if you have any thoughts on that in general.
Yeah, and it's a very, I think, significant problem area that people are finally, I think, paying more serious attention to. It's an area where there's new regulation that's come out in the U.S. in December with the new Biden administration. And when I was growing up, I thought that refrigerants were eating the ozone layer. That's what we used to learn in the 90s. It was like, oh, the poles are losing their ozone protection. There's going to be more skin cancer. Well, with the Montreal Protocol passing in 98, the global community essentially came together and banned the use of CFCs, the first generation refrigerants, or the refrigerants that used to be used around most of the world that were ozone depleting. But they replaced CFCs with HFCs and HCFCs, hydrochlorofluorocarbons and hydrofluorocarbons, which are not ozone depleting, but have ultra high GWP, ultra high global warming potential. And so though the newer refrigerants don't eat the ozone layer, they do cause massive amounts of warming, between 1,000 and 11,000 times, depending on which molecules. And those refrigerants are widely used around the world. One of the points, and Sam, you kind of highlighted this very nicely, one of the points of failure, and one of the points of leak is kind of continuous baseline leak that we tolerate as industrialized societies. The EPA in the US has, I think, up to 35% leakage rates permitted as of the current regulatory standards. Don't hold me to that, but it's in the 35% range, which is a really high amount of baseline leak annually allowed. So these things are allowed to basically leak constantly. The Washington Post had an article, an essay in January of this year, where they highlighted the EPA doing they did an undercover investigation of grocery stores and supermarkets in the US. These are places like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and Albertsons and Safeways, and I won't name anybody specifically. They did a cross-sectional, but what they found was that the leakage rates were like over 50%, and people were just allowing this stuff to get leaked. Now, there is regulation coming, and there are regulations in effect in Europe, and regulation coming in the US to start phasing out some of the worst refrigerants. Some of the most ultra-warming refrigerants are getting phased out over the next decade and a half. That's still a pretty slow phase out, but it's happening. And they're getting replaced with natural refrigerants, which are much cleaner. They have some safety concerns and they have cost issues, but they are much better, definitely. The issue with refrigerant leak is it's very hard to detect refrigerant leak directly. The kinds of technology needed to detect refrigerant leaks are quite involved and quite expensive. There are specialized sensors for detecting refrigerant leaks. Those sensors cost $20,000 to $50,000. That's an extremely expensive sensor. So very few companies can afford that. Therma, the company that I'm running, has sensors that are free. Essentially, we don't charge for sensors. It's $10 a month monitoring, which is a very different kind of price point for businesses to put sensors into. Now, Therma sensors cannot detect refrigerant leaks. They can detect temperature and humidity, and when married with time series data, what we can do is see when refrigeration units are starting to malperform. One of the reasons refrigeration units start to malperform and start to run hot is because of refrigerant leak or coolant leak. It's not the only reason, but essentially Therma acts like an early warning system. By catching refrigeration units that are malperforming, that are overworked, we generate leading indicators for companies and say, hey, this thing looks like it might be having a problem. It could be a refrigerant leak, or it could be a wiring issue, or a fan that needs to be cleaned, or something else, a door jamb that's loose. But we're able to, it's an over-inclusive set. We're able to catch refrigerant leaks indirectly by monitoring temp and humidity directly. And so that's how we try and attack the refrigerant problem. The reason we didn't go after it directly was the price point of the technology needed to monitor refrigerants is so expensive that businesses just wouldn't invest in it. Like no one's gonna, there's not a lot of economic cost, unfortunately, to leaking refrigerants. They're pretty cheap and they're pretty easy to replace. So it just makes it very hard unless you can find a way to kind of align incentives. And that's what we've been trying to do. And so that's how we kind of attack the refrigerant problem. But there's a lot of different innovation happening on the regulatory side and on the natural refrigerant side as well, which we really support.
Got it. Thank you. Uh, and I'm kind of curious how receptive your clients are to making the changes you recommend. And first of all, are all the changes you recommend, are they automatically implemented by the AI, or is it just you? Obviously, some of it is, like you said, warnings, and then they have to go implement something. Is there stuff that you also fully automate? And then I guess the second part of that question is for the stuff that they have to do, yeah, how receptive are they to it? For example, like if you're telling them, oh, you should be like closing the fridge door more. I'm imagining with like grocery stores have an insane amount of waste, right? Like you just look at like the fact that a lot of these fridges are literally open up to the air, right? And they could probably just like put like plastic sheets or like something to keep the cold in. Like, hey, do you tell them like, oh, you could make this change, and then do you get pushback on it?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts around that. So today, Therma only provides read information. We can't write. So it's an open, not closed system in hardware speak, although we would like to, and we plan to build towards a closed loop system. Right now, we're doing essentially optimization by triggering or driving either human change or systems change at the control level, but we're not doing that in an automated way. So we're making recommendations or providing real-time alerting. It's more like an alarm or a Nest 1.0 than a Nest 2.0, which is a kind of closed system. But yeah, we're early stage. We're in our second year. So we do expect and hope to eventually work directly within the control systems and turn it into more of a closed loop. But today it's an open and read-only system. We have found our customers to be extremely receptive to alerts and notifications because they have thousands of dollars of inventory at stake. And we're typically providing them with alerts in real time that escalate. We use an escalation similar to typical alarm systems that start with ground level staff, then go to ground level managers, then go to regionals, then go to corporate, depending on how severe it gets. People don't want to throw expensive inventory out. And when they find that there's issues that would lead to a spoilage event or a loss, they tend to be pretty responsive, especially in the current climate, no pun intended, where every dollar counts and where margins are so hit by, COVID and the hospitality industry struggling. They're looking for any way to save money. So, and also I'll say a lot of the locations we serve in retail, in hospitality, and in restaurants are less staffed than they were 2 years ago. There's fewer staff there because of COVID and because of cuts in labor. So they need remote monitoring more than ever because they don't have fully staffed teams constantly checking this stuff. And then the boxes, the locations are constantly getting opened and closed at irregular hours. So there's a lot of, we catch a lot of spoilage and loss prevention on nights and weekends and on times when the location might be understaffed. And then the last thing around that is there's a lot of issues around brownouts and weather events. So the summer months are when the majority of issues happen with refrigeration. So right now is kind of peak season. People are very concerned about inventory loss and waste, given all the climactic weather events and the storms and the heat waves that tend to hit the grids and locations. So I would say people have generally been extremely receptive to making the changes because it saves them money.
That's really great to hear. So I'm kind of curious in terms of when you founded the company. Well, why is this what you decided to do? Did you just analyze where can I have the most impact, and this is what you came up with? Did you have a prior connection to the cold chain industry? Well, why did you decide to do Therma versus anything else you could be doing?
Yeah, no, I wish I could say I just kind of like did a macro analysis and realized this was the problem. Life has a way of kind of making sense. My dad likes to say that it all makes sense in the rear view window. When you look back on the journey, you kind of see how the path got you there. But when you're going through it, you don't necessarily know where the road's taking you. So I didn't start working as an entrepreneur thinking I was working on Therma. Coming out of law school, I'd worked briefly with a public policy technologist who was an inspiration for me, Beth Novick. She was the deputy CTO in the Obama White House in the first administration when I was in the National Economic Council as a junior guy on the economic policy team. I met Beth there. She was also a recovering lawyer, as she likes to joke. She'd gone to Harvard 10 years before me. And when Beth left government, I decided to join her to start a center with her at NYU, where she teaches in New York, focused on building technology for public problem solving and for governance improvement, called the GovLab. And we raised about 15 million of grant funding for it, and we got going. I met my co-founder, Aaron Cohen, there at the GovLab. He was our third co-founder. He's in his mid-50s now. This is his fifth startup. He had been building technology startups since the late 90s and had worked as an entrepreneur and decided to go back to teaching at NYU. That's how we met. And from the GovLab, Aaron and I decided to start a company focused on improving regulatory compliance, governance workflows. And so we left the GovLab to start a company called Co-Inspect. Co-Inspect, or Collaborative Inspect, is the precursor to Therma. And Co-Inspect is actually the same company, just our first product. We rebranded as Therma with a second product, which became Therma. Co-Inspect was our original idea, which was using technology, and particularly mobile workflow and cloud, to automate and to improve and digitize paper-based health and safety regulation and compliance work. There's all these inspections and audits and line checks and compliance done around perishables and around products that go into our bodies. And we thought we could help improve health and safety using modern technology to replace pen and paper. The year we started Co-Inspect in 2015, Chipotle had this big food safety crisis back in late 15, early 16. You might remember Chipotle was struggling with a bunch of food safety issues. And so before long, we started working with food companies. We didn't plan to work in the food industry. We were working, I was a generalist coming from law and finance. And the only connection I had to food was that I grew up in California in the Central Valley. I grew up in a town called Fresno, about 3 hours south of San Francisco, which is a big ag town. It's a big part of the ag belt in America. And so we had farms and growers near our house, like walnut orchards behind my house, but no connection to food otherwise. We built Co-Inspect and started scaling it in the food supply chain. And 3 years into scaling Co-Inspect, we had raised some venture capital and we were growing. We're in about 5,000 locations. We were in the field watching users using the app. And we noticed, this is in 2019, we noticed that they were constantly checking temperatures around the product. And that was a key part of the safety and quality checks, checking temperature all the time, all day. And my colleague, who's now our CTO, Andrew Hager, Andrew looked at me and said, I don't think a mobile app is the right way to solve this. It still requires people to check this stuff. I think we could use a sensor. And that was in the summer of 19. We were watching users using Co-Inspect. Andrew uniquely had a background in both IoT and food. He's 40 now, but he had started his career building computers. Now he's a full stack software engineer, but he'd started building computers way back 20 years ago, and he'd always loved sensors and always loved IoT. So he's kind of played around with IoT in the background as a hobbyist. He also worked in a restaurant. He took a year off back in like 05, 06 from being an engineer to go to the Culinary Institute of America up in Napa. He got trained as a chef at the CIA and then worked in a pastry kitchen in Tokyo. So he actually worked in restaurants. So Andrew had the original insight that we should automate this. And he and I kind of looked at each other and said, okay, let's try that. And we discovered that there was an opportunity because LoRa, long range radio, had just started getting commercial traction as a new way of monitoring environments. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth sensors don't collect signal well. So when we talked to our Co-Inspect customers, we had companies like Starbucks and McDonald's using Co-Inspect on some of their locations. They said, oh, we don't have sensors for our refrigeration. The sensors don't work. And that's what led us to start working on temperature, humidity, equipment remote monitoring application, which is now Therma. And that's the story. That's how we ended up. And then 6 months in, we were reading about Project Drawdown, and we were looking at refrigeration and watching users using the early prototype. One of my investors called me up, Chuck Templeton. Chuck was the founder of OpenTable and did really well, and is now a climate investor in the food supply chain. He runs a fund called Seed to Growth, S2G, that does climate and food investing. Chuck called me and said, you should check out Project Drawdown. If you're working on smart refrigeration, you're not a compliance company anymore, you're a climate company. That was in the fall of 19. And so we started reading up on drawdown and realized, oh my God, food waste is such a massive problem. And Therma helps catch loss events. It's actually much more about catching loss events than the safety. The safety is there too. And then when we discovered refrigerants, it was like, oh wow, this is a massive, massive problem. And so since then, we've been a climate company.
Absolutely love it. Thank you. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Amazing. If anyone else has a last question, I'll give you 10 seconds. If not, I'll jump in. All right, Manik. My question for you is, if you if you were banned from doing Therma, I don't know why, I won't get into why, but let's pretend you were banned. What else would you be doing in the cold chain that you think would have the highest impact, if you had to start fresh?
Yeah, I mean, it's if I were to stay in the, if I were to kind of stay in the entrepreneurial side of the ledger, I would be looking at last mile innovation in the developing economies, but also in the developed world. I think last mile, building better and more efficient last mile refrigeration is a big area of opportunity. And it's not just about sensors, it's about the actual physical holding boxes or holding containers. It's about the packaging materials. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the last mile. And if I weren't working as an entrepreneur, I'd probably go back to government. My sister-in-law works in the Biden administration in the White House, and a bunch of my friends have joined the administration. I think I'd go back to government and try and work on the regulatory side. Because the cold chain has a lot of inefficiency, a lot of waste that could be avoided with better rules in place. But I still think there's a huge opportunity for innovators and entrepreneurs, which is why I'm right here.
Amazing. Yeah, it seems like there would be such huge opportunity in even that one EPA regulation you cited where they're allowing 35% leaks. Like, that's huge impact if we can change that right there. Manik, this has been amazing. I'm absolutely thrilled that you gave this presentation for us. Thank you so much. I am going to make a thread on the event's official channel in Slack. If anyone learned anything from this conversation, please post something you learned so that everyone else in the community can gain a bit of knowledge as well, and hopefully watch the recording, because I think this has been fantastic. Manik, dude, do you have any last words for us?
Really a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for taking time, everyone, to listen in. I'd love to chat. We're both looking for collaborators, looking for partners, always looking for investors and to grow our team. So please reach out if you listen to this and are interested, or find us online. Would love to talk, and keep up the great work. I just had a daughter last week, and I'm very, very appreciative and feeling grateful. And I think about the kind of world I want her to live in and grow up in. And it makes me think about the work from a different perspective now. It's like, oh, this is not just about us. It's about, the kind of world we want to leave to future generations. So keep up the great work, everyone. Sam, thanks so much for having me.
Amazing. Thanks so much, and congratulations again.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.